As good as we are, as good as all of us in this room are, we need Jesus. Those first three things are essentially the same point. We need Him. And it's offensive to people to say we need Him. Not offensive to us, right? But it's offensive to the world to be told that the only way to salvation is not through your acts, not through your effort, not through your goodness. The only way to salvation is through Jesus and Jesus alone. The gospel is offensive to those who find suffering offensive. The gospel tells us that our salvation was accomplished by Jesus' suffering and serving, and that following Him means to suffer and serve with Him. This offends people who want salvation to be easy. And then the one that I added, the gospel is offensive to those seeking relevance over obedience. And this is specifically for people like me, church leaders. There's such a push for relevant mission that replaces the purity of the gospel. Now, I'm all for relevance. Don't misunderstand me. We need to do things in ways that make sense. But it's insulting to modern spiritual leaders that emphasize that the gospel or de-emphasize the gospel if it feels out of touch with modern missional trends. Paul is all things to all people, but ultimately, the gospel is the message. Does that make sense? Like, we can do a lot of relevant stuff that people find entertaining, but if the gospel isn't present, we lost. And when I say the gospel, I mean our need for Jesus. And Paul's not ashamed of any of that. Have you ever found yourself wishing that the gospel included something else? I wish that the gospel said this. I wish that there was more revelation here. I understand that. You ever wish that the gospel included more push toward like politics or social justice issues or, listen, I understand all that, but just the way it is, it's perfect. Just the way it is. And that's what Paul's saying. I am not ashamed, for it is the power of God. It. I want you to look back at that text in Romans 1. There are at least 3 reasons that Paul says I'm not ashamed that we're going to talk about tonight. I'm not ashamed because the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. And I'm not ashamed because the gospel says that the righteous shall live by faith. 3 reasons. Like Paul is a lawyer here in Romans 1. He lays out systematically a case for why he is not ashamed, and then consequently, why we should not be ashamed. So if you ever find yourself wishing that it were more or it were different or that we would, Paul says this is enough. Just the way it is, it's enough. And I want to unpack this in 15 minutes. The power of God. And we may just be here, and we'll pick up if we have to tonight. Because I think there's such power in this idea. Paul uses a device throughout his writing, and he uses it here. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power. He contrasts words with power. The gospel is power. Do you believe that? The gospel is power. The gospel is not a concept. It's not a philosophy. The gospel is power. He doesn't say the gospel brings power. He says the gospel is power. Now, I'm a word guy, but I want to try to convince you in the next couple of minutes that that's really important. That's how it reads in the original language. The gospel is power. It is the power of God. And I want it to be more than grammar to you. Because as much as any lesson in this first half of Romans, this is one that stands out. There's a difference in saying the gospel has power and the gospel is power. Has means there is a source outside that instills the power in something. Is means it's the source of power. Casey has green eyes. My wife. They're beautiful. She has green eyes. She has green eyes. She's not green eyes. She has green eyes. Outside of her, her parents came together, and through the creative order, she was given green eyes. That's different from saying that Casey is green eyes. Right? Think about it this way. Casey has a loving heart. And if you know her, you know that's true. She has a loving heart. That's different from saying Casey is love, which I could say. Has love and is love are fundamentally different things. One is a conduit of something that exists elsewhere. One is the source of the very thing. And Paul says this message of Jesus Christ, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, doesn't just have power, it is power. You don't just use it to tap into power, it is power. You don't read a bunch of books on marriage or whatever topic that exist apart from Jesus and then add Jesus to that to bring power to that. The gospel in and of itself can transform all those things. It's not to say you shouldn't read those books, but it's to say that the gospel by itself is the single greatest power that exists. That's what Paul says. The gospel message is the power of God. Now, what changes if we view, as people who possess that gospel, as people who have been redeemed by that gospel, as people who believe and carry that gospel, what changes for us when we make that subtle shift in our thinking from has to is? Now we're in the deep end on this theologically. I see the eyes glazed over, but there's power there. That's what Paul wants to unpack. That's what he's trying to unlock. And if you've got eyes to see, you'll see it. What's the difference in has and is for us who believe?
It gives us much more authority in one sense, and much more lack of fear.
Yes. Authority, it's a great word. Because that's what the gospel is. It's power. Is it possible that Paul's inspired? He's got a special, unique gifting from the Holy Spirit. He's an apostle. Like he's met Jesus on the road to Damascus. He's not us. We're not him. But is it possible that Paul is able to say, "I'm not ashamed," because he knows he has power? And maybe sometimes we just think we got a little bit, if that. Keller says the gospel message is actually the power of God in verbal cognitive form. It lifts people up. It transforms and changes things. When it's outlined and explained or reflected upon, its power is released. We far too often think that the gospel has power. So let me do all these works. Let me perform all this stuff. Let me do the stuff out in the world that I want to do. Try to live a perfect life and talk about Jesus on Sundays. I don't want to be too simplistic here. I don't want to suggest something that's inappropriate, and I don't want it to be so up high that that's a plane when it gets up, it's hard to put on the ground. But let me tell you, there is no self-help book that you will read that has more power than the gospel message of Jesus Christ. I'm not saying you shouldn't read those books. Don't get me wrong. But there is nothing like the work that's done when you open the text and you meditate and contemplatively you think about what does the gospel, what has the gospel done in my heart? What can that message that does bring hope and alignment and authority and power and conviction, what can that message do through me? That's where it's at. That kind of thinking, that kind of reading, that kind of work, that's where the power's at. And then you can tell the difference between books who are written like that and then just books who are popular. And then those kind of books that are written from that perspective add even more layers of spiritual growth on you. Everybody's not a theologian. Everybody's not called to be a theologian. You don't have to be one. You don't have to read books of theology on your porch at 5 o'clock in the morning and drink coffee. Although if you do, that's cool. But the gospel's the power. It's the power. And I want to plug into that power. I don't know about you. One of my very first teachers in school, it was a class called Old Testament Exegesis. And I was a 18-year-old-ish first-year student. And I had preached a little bit, as a teenager. And Old Testament exegesis is like it sounds. It's kind of dry. But he said in that class, over the course of that class, we had to write a sermon on Amos chapter 6. And that was the course. I'll never forget it. But he said, there is a ministry to scholarship. And don't ever be ashamed of that. Don't ever be ashamed of that. Everybody's not called to that. But I'll tell you what everybody is called to. If you're here, all of us, we are called to tap into the power of the gospel. I don't care what you've been through. I don't care what you're going through. If you sit alone with the Lord tonight, tomorrow, and you say, I believe in the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the hope of the new life, and I need some work that's done, that will be done in my heart, that work will be done. And what will be created in those places, in those spaces, is worth every New York Times bestseller you can put your hands on. Everyone. Because that's where the power's at. No matter what we've been through, no matter what we've done. So let me ask this question. What does the power of God do? What does Paul say? I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power. How does he finish that? Unto salvation, for salvation, right? For who? Everyone who believes. So we're going to see here, and this is where it's easy, depending on what your focus is. When I say your, I don't mean, again, us in this room necessarily, even if you're watching this, but generally, depending on what your persuasion is, what your perspective is, it's easy to see one thing or the other. Because I want you to know there is exclusivity to what Paul says, but not complete exclusivity. Now, this is what I mean by that. The power of God for salvation. For who? Everyone. Everyone's everyone. The Jew first, which we're going to get into to Israel down the road. I don't want to spend a lot of our time tonight talking about that. Jews were the progenitor of Jesus, the cradle of the Messiah, the first ones that received the gospel. I think that's what Paul's alluding to. I don't think it's a theological thing that the Jews have first in line. Now, we'll talk about that down the road. But essentially, Paul says Jews and Gentiles, Jews and Greeks, everybody has access. There is no exclusion as far as access. Anybody can access this power. Anyone can access this power, but not everybody does. And that's where the exclusivity comes. And Paul says, I'm not ashamed to say it. If you want that power, you got to believe. And I'm telling you tonight, if you want that power, you got to believe. Now, we talked about doctrine a couple of weeks ago. That's kind of got a negative connotation to it. We talked about obligation earlier, 2 weeks ago, and then tonight it's kind of got a negative connotation to it. Exclusivity's got a really negative connotation to it, doesn't it? Why is that? Nobody wants to be excluded, right? You ever were you ever not picked for a team? I don't know how that feels, right? We don't want to be picked last, let alone not picked at all. Why else? I read an article this morning. I try to every day. I don't every day, but there's a couple of places that I source some stuff to read and think about. And one of the things that popped up this morning that I read through, there's a term. I think I used this term. I think Clay can help me remember this. Did I use the word catechism a couple of weeks ago? I thought I did. Catechism is a kind of historical term where religious groups catechized their children. And essentially, it was just a strain or a train of doctrine that they wanted their kids to learn. These are the fundamentals that we want. And to go through catechism meant these are the specific things that you learn. We don't use those vocabulary terms in Churches of Christ, but we do that. I mean, there are things we want people to learn. And the article that I read this morning talked about how whether we know it or not, all of us have been catechized by the world. And there's nothing, it just is what it is. Some of us more than others. And probably there are people affiliated with churches that have been catechized too much by the world. But the truth is, it just is. Like we're in the frying pan. And that water has been turned up over time. And we have been catechized by the world. And it shows up in places like the feelings that we have when we talk about exclusivity, because we don't like that in a religious context. That Jesus would say, I am, and then anything afterwards would have been heretical in his context. And in our context, in modern America, 21st century, to say there is a way, and by the way, it's the only one, and if you want life, you got to go down that way, that's exclusivity. And that's just the way of it. Now, Paul says anybody can access this power, but if you want to access this power, you got to believe. And if you don't believe, then you're not going to have that power. You can wish and you can hope and you can want, you can dream, you can plan, you can pretend, but you're not going to have that power if you don't believe. And Paul's going to spend several chapters talking about what belief is. It's not just a mental assent. It's not just a decision that you make to say, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or I believe that Jesus is who he says. That's certainly a part of it. But it is this, as imperfect as it is, and it's imperfect, it is this faith-fueled walk. It's this faith-fueled obedience. It happens more than once. It happens once initially when a person comes into contact with the blood of Jesus, but then it happens daily. It's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. But if you believe, if Jesus is really your leader, if Jesus is really your king, then I want you to know, whether you feel it or not, you have that power. The power, not access to something that has the power, but the power. And Paul says he's not ashamed of that. So don't be ashamed of exclusivity. That doesn't mean that we're unkind. People are ashamed because it's exclusive, and if it's true, then this power forces me to submit. If the gospel changes all these things, my heart, my direction, my identity, my mind, my understanding, my relationships, then that means that some of those things are going to have to change in me. I want you to see how this exclusivity works, because I think there's some space here to have some really encouraging conversations with non-believers. The truth is, while there's exclusivity at the end of this, at the front of this, there is no exclusivity. Anybody can have it. Anybody can have it. Everybody has access, but not everybody has power. Let me say just real briefly something about belief, because I don't want to end on that, just the way that is. There's no separation in the Bible between what believing in our head and professing with our mouth and attaching ourselves to. There's no separation in all those ideas. Confidently acting on the promises that God has given. There's no separation whatsoever. The English language, I don't know the last count. Somebody might have a better count than me. You know how many words the English language has? Take a guess. It's kind of a big question, isn't it? We don't want to be way off. There's a lot of words. Come on, somebody guess. 100,000, okay. 500,000. It's over 1 million words in the English language. Now, we make up a lot of words, especially in the 21st century, that are nonsensical, right? But there's a lot of words, a lot of words in the English language. You know how many words are in the Hebrew language? How many words are in the Greek language? The Hebrew language, there's a couple thousand words. The Greek language, there's 30, 40,000 words. They didn't have. Now, what's interesting and ironic about that is that because we have so much more, you would think that we're this wealthy language, but we're actually a pretty poor language. Because there's so many words that just don't mean anything. Belief is one of them. It just doesn't mean anything. Or it can mean everything, you know? Love's that way. Obedience is that way. And the Hebrew language, before the Greek language, the New Testament's written in Greek, there were layers and meanings. And in the Greek language, the word that Paul uses for belief, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God to everyone who believes. It's a real rich word. It's a real rich, just incredibly wealthy word. And when the first audience heard that in their own language especially, because it wasn't the language of faith, that was the Hebrew language. The Greek language, when they heard that word belief, they knew it was more than just a mental assent. I can know in my head that I have 3 sons. But that's different from believing in my 3 sons, or believing that I have 3 sons, or walking like I have 3 sons. So belief is this huge idea for the Apostle Paul. It's one of the wealthiest words that he uses. There's a lot to unpack, and if you'll hang in, there's a lot of depth and growth that can happen, even in talking about words like belief. I'm not going to go ahead because there's just a lot left about the righteousness of God, that the phrase that Paul uses there in verse 17. Did we get through 16? Let me make a mark. Okay. So we'll pick up at verse 17, and I'll try to go through it pretty quick. But next week we will start that section, and it will take a couple of weeks. If you've got questions or comments or concerns about any of that coming up, please holler at me. I certainly want to give it our full attention. Thanks so much. Love you. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.